The first light of dawn crept slowly across the frozen landscape of the Eastern Front. It was early 1943, and winter still ruled the land with an iron grip. The air was bitterly cold, sharp enough to sting the skin with every breath. A thin layer of mist hovered just above the ground, rolling like ghostly waves over the snow-covered fields. The world seemed still, silent, almost peaceful. But beneath that silence lay the heavy tension of an approaching battle. For miles in every direction, the land bore scars of countless clashes, burnt-out trenches, shattered trees, frozen craters, and the blackened skeletons of tanks long destroyed. Across this desolate plain, rows of Soviet T-34 tanks waited in near-perfect formation. Their dark silhouettes barely visible in the weak morning light, they resembled sleeping giants preparing to rise. Frost clung to every edge of their armor. The red stars painted on their turrets were faded, chipped by months of fighting. Steam drifted from the hatches as the crews inside exhaled warm air into the cold metal shells that had become their second homes. Inside one of those tanks, a young commander named Mikhail Antonov wiped condensation from his periscope lens. He had fought in the Battle of Moscow, survived the disastrous retreat near Kharkov, and now, at only 24 years old, carried the weight of leading a crew through yet another brutal engagement. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the cold that sank into his bones. He glanced at his men. The loader, Yuri, rubbed his gloved hands together, blowing hot breath into them. The gunner, Pavel, adjusted his targeting controls with focused precision. The driver, Stepan, hunched over his console, waiting for the order to start the engine. Outside, Soviet infantry moved between the tanks, checking weapons, tightening straps, cleaning the frost from their rifles. No one spoke louder than a whisper. Every man knew the Germans were out there, somewhere beyond the fog, advancing in numbers that intelligence reports described only as significant. For the soldiers on the ground, that vague word carried an enormous weight. It could mean a handful of panzers, or it could mean an entire spearhead of Tiger tanks supported by veteran infantry. A distant rumble rolled through the air, deep and slow, almost like thunder. The soldiers froze, listening. Another rumble followed, then another. The Germans were moving. Not fast, not yet, but approaching steadily like a storm building on the horizon. Comrade Petrov, the battalion commander, climbed onto a T-34 turret and raised his binoculars. His face was pale from the cold, but his eyes burned with intensity. "They're coming," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Then he shouted, "All crews, prepare engines!" The stillness shattered. One by one, the tank engines roared to life, their diesel motors shaking snow from the ground. Thick exhaust spilled into the frosty air. The sound was deafening, echoing across the plain and sending flocks of crows scattering from distant trees. Inside Mikhail's tank, the vibrations grew stronger as the engine warmed. He tightened his headset and spoke through the intercom. "Crew, check readiness. Load high explosive. Be prepared to switch to armor-piercing on command." "Loaded and ready," Yuri called out. "Optics aligned," Pavel added. "Tracks warmed. Engine holding steady," Stepan confirmed. The mist began to shift as the morning wind picked up, revealing more of the landscape. Far ahead, dark shapes appeared, barely visible through the haze, but everyone knew what they were. Tanks. German tanks. The dreaded panzers. The anxiety in the Soviet ranks grew heavier. Stories of German armor, especially the massive Tiger I, had become legend. Tales of their armor being impenetrable, their guns able to destroy a T-34 from over a kilometer away. Whether all the stories were true didn't matter. Fear had a way of exaggerating reality. But the Soviets had their own advantages: mobility, numbers, and the determination to defend their homeland. And above all, they had learned that the Tiger was not invincible if caught in the right conditions. Petrov lowered his binoculars and raised his fist. "Hold positions," he ordered. "Wait for them to enter the valley." Minutes felt like hours. The rumbling grew louder. The ground vibrated under the weight of advancing armor. Through the clearing fog, outlines became clearer. Long-barreled Panzer IVs leading the spearhead, backed by the unmistakable, towering shape of a Tiger tank. Mikhail swallowed hard. The moment had arrived. The radio crackled. "All units," Petrov's voice commanded. "Prepare to engage. Once they cross the ridge, fire at will." The German formation approached the valley, unaware that dozens of Soviet tanks lay concealed beyond the mist. Mikhail steadied his breathing. "Gunner, target the lead panzer. Wait for my mark." The tension in the tank was suffocating. Every man braced himself. The Germans crossed the ridge. Fire. The fog on the horizon slowly thinned as the rumble of German engines grew louder. The battlefield, still half asleep under the pale morning light, began to tremble. German panzer divisions advanced with terrifying discipline, their movements perfectly synchronized, like parts of a massive iron beast crawling across the land. The long-barreled Panzer IVs formed the vanguard, each tank gliding smoothly over the frozen ground, their engines humming with cold efficiency. Behind them, the Tiger I tanks moved with a slow and terrifying confidence. The Tigers dwarfed the panzers around them, massive, angular, thick-plated monsters carrying the infamous 88mm cannon, capable of punching through nearly any armor on the battlefield. Their presence alone radiated an aura of invincibility. Even the German infantry marching beside them felt safer, strengthened by the belief that nothing could stand against their armored titans. Lieutenant Friedrich Adler, commanding a Panzer IV, scanned the horizon from his open hatch. He was a veteran of North Africa and France, decorated twice, respected by his men and feared by his enemies. But even he could feel something unsettling about this battlefield. The Eastern Front was different, brutal, unpredictable, unforgiving. Every kilometer felt like eternity. Every village they passed carried the ghost of previous battles. Adler raised his binoculars. The distant valley ahead was covered in a thin curtain of mist. To him it appeared too still, too silent, too calm. "Keep your eyes open," he told his crew. "The Russians could be anywhere." His gunner Franz chuckled nervously. "Sir, the Russians are everywhere. That's the problem." The tank crew laughed lightly, but the humor faded quickly as the radios crackled with scattered reports of movement. German reconnaissance had spotted signs of large Soviet forces nearby, supply tracks, abandoned campfires, and traces of tank formations hidden in the fog. "Panzer column, maintain formation," came the command through the radio. The tanks continued forward, their tracks grinding into the hardened earth. German infantry followed closely, moving from cover to cover, rifles ready. Some scanned the sky expecting Soviet aircraft, while others eyed the tree line for hidden anti-tank guns. Then suddenly, the fog shifted, swept aside by a cold gust of wind. And Adler saw them. Dark shapes, dozens of them, rose stretching across the valley. "Tanks!" Adler shouted. "Hold! Prepare to engage!" But before the Germans could react, the first Soviet shell shrieked through the air, slamming into the leading panzer. The explosion knocked several infantrymen off their feet and sent debris flying in every direction. Smoke rose as the panzer burned, turning into an inferno within seconds. The Germans had walked directly into an ambush. "Franz, target the nearest T-34. Loader, armor piercing." The turret spun, metal grinding as the gun aligned with its target. The loader shoved a shell into the breech, slamming it shut. The recoil rocked the panzer when the shot fired, sending a shockwave through the cabin. The shell struck the T-34, but the Soviet tank kept moving, its angled armor deflecting the hit. "Scheisse! Didn't penetrate!" Before Adler could respond, another Soviet shell detonated near the Tiger behind him. The explosion tore into the ground beside the giant machine, covering it in debris but failing to damage its thick armor. Then the Tiger's 88mm cannon roared. The earth itself seemed to shake as the shell tore through the air and smashed directly into a charging T-34, ripping it apart in a violent burst. The turret flew several meters before crashing back to the ground. The Tiger crew cheered through the radio. But the Soviet tanks kept coming, dozens of them, their engines roaring like thunder. The Germans were outnumbered, surrounded, forced into a defensive line. Adler's radio filled with overlapping voices. "Panzer 12 destroyed! Left flank collapsing! Tiger advancing to support! Infantry pinned down!" The battlefield dissolved into chaos. Adler felt his tank shudder as a Soviet shell struck their side armor. Sparks flew inside the cabin. The driver cursed, fighting to keep control. "Minor damage. We're still operational." "Return and fire," Adler commanded. They fired again, and this time their shot found its mark. A Soviet tank jolted violently, smoke pouring from its turret. But there were too many of them. The panzer column, once confident and orderly, was now struggling to hold position. The Tigers were powerful, but even they were beginning to take hits from multiple directions. Adler clenched his jaw. "We have to push forward. If we stay here, we die." He gave the order, and the panzer rolled ahead, directly toward the flames, toward the growing roar of Soviet engines. The clash of steel had begun, and Adler knew this day would be unlike anything he had faced before.
A faint echo of explosions rolled across the valley as the Soviet tanks pushed forward with growing determination. The air was thick with smoke, turning the morning light into a dim, reddish glow. Every breath tasted of metal, ash, and burning fuel. Yet the roar of the T-34 engine seemed to grow louder with every passing second, not just from the machines themselves, but from the unyielding will of the crews inside them. The Soviet commander, Mikhail Antonov, braced himself inside his shaking tank as Stepan, the driver, maneuvered them through the chaos. The battlefield ahead looked like a storm of steel and fire, tanks burning, shells streaking through the air, infantry diving for cover. The Germans had been caught off guard, but they were recovering quickly, forming defensive firing lines and pushing their Tigers forward to stabilize the front. Mikhail stared through the periscope, identifying targets. "Gunner, enemy tank at 12 o'clock, range 800 meters, fire when ready." Inside the turret, Pavel gritted his teeth and adjusted the sight. "On target, firing." The T-34 recoiled violently. The shell streaked across the battlefield and exploded against the side of a Panzer IV. Flames erupted from the impact point as the German tank lurched to one side, smoke billowing from its hatches. "Yes," Yuri shouted, "direct hit." But the celebration was short-lived. A deafening blast struck nearby, shaking the entire tank. Dirt and debris poured down from above. Stepan cursed and corrected their course. "Tiger! Tiger tank on the right flank!" The shadowy form of a Tiger I emerged from behind the wreckage of a barn, its massive cannon already aimed toward the Soviet line. For a moment, the battlefield fell silent, as if everyone was waiting for that one inevitable shot. Then the Tiger fired. The 88mm shell screamed through the air and smashed into a T-34 beside Mikhail's tank. The explosion was catastrophic. The turret blew off, flames rising like a pillar. Mikhail clenched his fists, jaw tight with anger and grief. "Keep moving," he ordered. "We can't let them get a clear shot." Stepan pushed the tank forward, weaving between burning wreckage. Soviet infantry followed closely behind, taking advantage of the advancing armor to move up the field. "Commander," Pavel said urgently, "3 more German tanks on the ridge, Panzer IVs." Mikhail scanned the ridge. The German formation was tightening, turning the chaotic fight into an organized defensive line. Their strategy was obvious: stop the Soviet momentum before it became an unstoppable breakthrough. "Load armor-piercing," Mikhail ordered. Yuri rammed the shell into the breach. "Loaded. Target the leftmost panzer. Fire when ready." The gun thundered again. The shell struck the German tank's turret, tearing a hole through its armor. Smoke erupted, and the panzer fell still. But the other two panzers returned fire immediately. The first German shell slammed into the ground just meters ahead, showering the T-34 with dirt. The second ricocheted off their angled armor with a horrifying screech. "Hit, but no damage," Pavel shouted. "Armor held." "Good. Again, we take the ridge or we die down here." The Soviet tanks surged forward, dozens of them breaking from the fog like spirits of vengeance. Their engines roared, the ground trembling beneath them. Artillery fire from behind the Soviet lines joined the battle, pounding the German positions. But the Germans were equally fierce. The Tigers shifted position, protecting the Panzer IVs and forming an armored bulwark. Their cannons roared one after another, each shot tearing through Soviet steel. Every minute, another T-34 went up in flames. Inside Mikhail's tank, sweat and smoke filled the cramped cabin. The crew worked with mechanical precision, loading, targeting, firing, and adjusting. Each man moved not out of fear, but out of a deep, unbreakable duty. A sudden burst of explosions shook the right flank. Mikhail turned his periscope and saw a group of Soviet tank destroyers entering the battlefield from the forest. Su-76 self-propelled guns rolled into position, firing over open sights. "Reinforcements!" Yuri shouted. "Finally!" The Su-76s unleashed a volley of shells toward the ridge. The Panzer IVs were forced to divert their fire. The Tiger turned its turret toward the newcomers, but the shifting focus created an opening. "Now!" Mikhail roared. "Advance! All units, advance!" The Soviet tanks charged up the slope. Their tracks tore into the frozen ground as they surged toward the ridge. Mikhail's T-34 fired again, this time directly into the flank of a Panzer IV. The explosion illuminated the hillside like lightning. The Germans began to fall back, forced to regroup under the pressure. Even the mighty Tiger was overwhelmed by the sheer number of Soviet vehicles closing in from multiple angles. As the Soviets reached the top of the ridge, Mikhail saw the battlefield below, a vast plain of smoke, fire, and shattered steel stretching toward the horizon. "We've broken their line," Pavel whispered, almost in disbelief. Mikhail nodded slowly, exhaustion settling into his bones. "But the battle isn't over," he said quietly. "This is only the beginning." The tank rumbled forward, ready for whatever came next.
The afternoon sun hung low over the battlefield, casting long shadows across the frozen river that wound through the valley like a scar. Smoke drifted over the water, carried by sharp winter winds. The ice cracked and groaned beneath the weight of metal giants preparing for another brutal confrontation. Both armies knew this river crossing would decide the momentum of the entire offensive. Whoever controlled it would control the advance. On the German side, the remaining panzers regrouped near the tree line. Mechanics rushed between the tanks, patching holes, tightening tracks, replacing shattered tools. Infantry dug fresh trenches along the riverbank, setting up machine gun nests and hauling crates of ammunition across the ice. The roar of a Tiger's engine broke the tense silence, shaking frost from the branches overhead. Inside Tiger 201, Oberfeldwebel Kurt Reinhardt studied the map laid across his knees. His face, hardened by years of war, remained unreadable, but his crew could sense the weight he carried. They had already lost 2 Tigers today, and now they faced the Soviets across a narrow river crossing that offered almost no maneuvering room. "Commander," Helmuth said softly, "reports say they're massing armor on the opposite bank, lots of it." Reinhardt closed his eyes for a moment. "I know.
We hold them here, or there will be nothing left behind us to hold. He climbed halfway out of the hatch. The cold air bit into his skin instantly, but he didn't flinch. Across the frozen water, the distant rumble of engines echoed. Dark silhouettes gathered in the smoke, the unmistakable shapes of T-34s and heavy KV tanks preparing to push forward. Not far away on the Soviet side, Commander Mikhail Antonov, battered, exhausted, but unbroken, leaned against the hull of his tank. His uniform was darkened by soot and streaked with frozen mud, yet his eyes held a fire that refused to die. His T-34 crew stood around him, catching their breath. The earlier breakthrough had cost them dearly. Many friends had fallen, but there was no turning back now. "Comrades," Mikhail said, his voice low but unshaken, "the Germans are holding the river. If we break through here, their entire flank collapses." Pavel, his gunner, nodded. "We'll make it. We didn't come this far to stop now." Stepan checked the engine one last time. "She'll hold. She always does." The tension in the air thickened. Orders crackled through radios on both sides. Artillery in the distance adjusted their angles. The world seemed to draw in a deep breath, preparing for the inevitable. And then the river exploded into life. The first Soviet shells roared across the water, smashing into the German trenches. Snow and debris erupted skyward. German machine guns opened fire instantly, their rhythmic chatter echoing across the valley. "Forward!" Mikhail shouted, pounding the hull. "Across the river!" The T-34 engines howled as the tanks surged toward the ice. The first group moved quickly, firing on the move to suppress the German line. The ice groaned under their weight, but held, for now. On the German side, Reinhardt ducked back into the Tiger. "Target incoming armor. First tank on the left. Fire!" The Tiger's 88mm cannon thundered. The shell streaked across the river and slammed into a Soviet tank, tearing through its side armor and sending flames bursting from the hatches. But more tanks replaced it immediately. The Soviet line advanced like a steel tide. Inside Mikhail's tank, everything shook as German shells hammered the ice around them. Water burst upward in icy fountains. The entire river vibrated. "Keep moving," he shouted. "If we stop, we're dead." Pavel fired again and again, each shot echoing through the cabin. They struck a German machine gun nest, silencing it. They hit a Panzer attempting to maneuver behind cover. But the Tiger, the real threat, stood unbroken. Reinhardt's Tiger turned its massive turret toward Mikhail's tank. Inside the Tiger, Helmut called out, "Target locked." Reinhardt narrowed his eyes. "Fire!" The Tiger unleashed its deadly shot. Inside the T-34, Mikhail heard the roar. A split second later, the world detonated to their right as a nearby tank was ripped apart, flames consuming it instantly. "They're targeting us next," Pavel shouted. "I know," Mikhail replied. "Stepan, zigzag! Don't give him a clean shot!" The T-34 swerved violently across the ice, the treads biting desperately for traction. Another 88mm shell screamed past, missing by meters. Ice shattered where it struck, leaving a jagged crater. Stepan cursed. "The ice won't hold much longer." "Then we don't stay on it," Mikhail said. "Speed up." The tank roared forward, slipping and sliding as it raced toward the opposite bank. Meanwhile, the Su-76s behind the Soviet line opened fire, their lighter guns barking rapidly. While they lacked the sheer power to penetrate a Tiger frontally, they were deadly against the supporting panzers. Several German tanks were disabled within minutes, smoke pouring from their hulls. Reinhardt felt the pressure mounting. "They're flanking us," Helmut warned. "Not if we break their spearhead first," Reinhardt replied. "Target the lead T-34. Again the Tiger fired. This time the shell struck Mikhail's tank directly, but on the glacis plate, at the perfect angle. The round ricocheted upward, missing the turret by inches. Inside the T-34, the crew was thrown violently. Pavel gasped, "We should be dead." "Not today," Mikhail growled. "Return fire." They fired. The shell hit the Tiger's mantlet, rocking the tank but failing to penetrate. Reinhardt gripped the hatch rim, steadying himself. They're brave, but bravery doesn't stop an 88. As the Tiger prepared to fire again, a thunderous crack echoed through the valley. The ice beneath the center of the river gave way. Several Soviet tanks plunged through, disappearing in seconds. German infantry scrambled back as the freezing water surged. The entire battlefield shifted in an instant. "Get off the ice!" Mikhail roared. Stepan pushed the engine to its limit. The T-34 leapt forward, slipping and sliding as it raced toward the opposite bank. Reinhardt watched the chaos unfold. "Pull back from the river's edge. We hold the high ground." But the Soviets that made it across did not stop. They regrouped immediately, using rising smoke as their shield. Su-76s crossed on the remaining ice sheets farther north. Soviet infantry swarmed across makeshift bridges, shouting battle cries. The clash intensified. Mikhail's tank now had a direct line of fire on the German ridge. He saw the Tiger repositioning for a final stand. "Pavel, are you ready?" Pavel breathed deeply. "Always." Both tanks aimed at each other. Both commanders knew only one would survive the next few seconds. The valley held its breath. The cannons fired. Flame, smoke, impact, screeching metal. The battle for the river crossing reached its deadly peak, and neither side knew who would emerge from the smoke alive. The Iron Valley had always been a quiet, peaceful stretch of land. Rolling hills, scattered farms, and a river that wound through the fields like a silver ribbon. But on this cold, gray morning of 1944, the valley had become something else entirely. A vast killing ground of steel giants preparing for one of the most brutal armored clashes of the war. The mist that clung to the lowlands slowly lifted as the engines of dozens of tanks rumbled to life. The ground vibrated under their weight. The smell of fuel drifted through the air. In the distance, distant artillery echoed like thunder across the sky. The valley was waking up, not to life, but to war. Colonel Heinrich Brandt, commander of the German Armored Battalion, stood in the turret of his Tiger I, scanning the horizon. His crew waited silently inside, fully aware that the next hour could decide their fate. The Tiger's thick armor and deadly 88mm cannon made it the king of the battlefield. But today they faced an opponent just as determined. Experienced Soviet tank crews in fast, aggressive T-34s advancing in large numbers. Brandt lowered himself into the turret. "All crews, stand ready. The Soviets will enter the valley within minutes. Hold your fire until they commit. Let them come close, then we strike." Across the valley, the Soviets were already advancing. Captain Viktor Sokolov rode in the lead T-34, feeling the familiar vibration of the tank beneath his boots. The weather was sharp and biting, but what unsettled him more was the silence. Not a single German gun had opened fire yet. "Something's wrong," Victor muttered. "They're here. They're waiting." His radio operator looked nervous. "Maybe they pulled back?" Victor shook his head. "No, Tigers don't retreat from defensive positions. They're hiding in the hills, in the fog, watching us." He raised his binoculars. The hills seemed empty, but Victor trusted his instincts. He had fought the Germans too long to believe otherwise. "Keep your spacing. Spread out. Don't give them a tight formation to hit. Stay low in the terrain. We're moving into a trap. I can feel it." His driver Kolya nodded. "Understood, Comrade Captain. I'll keep us on the low ground." The Soviet column adjusted formation, fanning out as they descended into the valley. For several long moments, nothing happened. Then the valley exploded. A Tiger I, hidden behind a patch of trees, fired first. The 88mm round screamed across the valley, striking a T-34 in the side. The tank erupted into a fireball, its turret thrown high into the air. Before the Soviets could react, two more Tigers opened fire from the ridge. The ambush had begun. "Hard left!" Victor shouted, as his tank lurched violently to avoid incoming fire. Three more shells slammed into the ground behind him, throwing mud and flames high into the air. "All tanks, return fire!" Victor yelled into the radio. "Enemy Tigers on the eastern ridge!" Soviet tanks scattered in all directions, some taking cover behind burned-out tractors and farmhouses, others rushing forward to close the distance. The T-34s fired their 76mm guns, their shots bouncing off the thick frontal armor of the Tigers. Inside Bronze Tiger, the loader rammed another shell into the breach. "Target at 11 o'clock, Soviet medium tank advancing." The Tiger fired again, the recoil rocking the entire vehicle. The shell struck another T-34 dead center, destroying it instantly. But now the Soviets were fighting back. From the northern tree line, a wave of T-34-85s appeared, newer, deadlier models with long-barrel 85mm guns. Their arrival shifted the balance. They fired in rapid succession, pinning the German ridge positions under a storm of armor-piercing shells. Brandt's gunner cursed. "They've brought in 85s. They can penetrate our sides at this range." Brandt clenched his jaw. "Then we don't show them our sides." He ordered his driver to angle the tank and reverse toward better cover. But as they moved, three Soviet shells slammed into the ridge, forcing the Tigers to reposition. Meanwhile, Victor's tank was pushing forward, weaving through burning wrecks and shell craters. "Kolya, straight ahead! We need to flank them!" Kolya accelerated, the tank bouncing violently as they crossed the uneven ground. A shot exploded just meters away, too close. "We can't win by trading shots. We have to get behind them. Climb the western slope." As they climbed, the battlefield unfolded behind them. Fires burning everywhere, black smoke rising into the sky, tanks dueling at point-blank range in the valley below. At the ridgetop, Victor saw his opportunity. Three Tigers were below, firing at Soviet units in the valley, unaware that a T-34 had appeared behind them. "Gunner, target the rear Tiger! Fire!" The T-34's gun thundered. The shell struck the Tiger's rear armor, the weakest point. Flames erupted from the engine compartment. The second Tiger began to turn its turret toward Victor's position, but too late. "Fire again!" The shot hit the turret ring. The tank stopped moving, smoke pouring from its hatches. Brandt saw the destruction from his own turret. "Damn it! They're on our flank! Driver, rotate! Get us out of this position!" His Tiger moved to retreat toward the forest line, but a Soviet shell struck the track, snapping it clean off. The tank lurched, immobilized. Inside, the crew scrambled. Brandt exhaled slowly, accepting the inevitable. "Prepare to abandon the tank. This position is lost." Explosions rocked the valley as both sides continued trading fire, but gradually the German line began to crumble. With two Tigers destroyed and others damaged, the remaining German armor began withdrawing toward the eastern hills. The Soviets pushed forward, securing the valley. Victor's tank rolled past the burning wreck of Brandt's Tiger. He stared at it silently, a symbol of a hard-won victory. The Iron Valley belonged to the Soviets now. But Victor knew this was only one battle, in a war full of battles, victories, losses, and sacrifices. "We keep moving," he told his crew. "The road ahead is long." The engine growled. The tank pushed forward into the smoke. The black forest stood like a towering wall of dark trees and frozen silence, an ancient shadowed maze where visibility was low, mobility was limited, and danger lurked behind every trunk. But on this bitter winter morning, the silence shattered. Engines growled. Tracks snapped through branches. The forest floor trembled under the weight of armored giants moving into position on both sides. For the Soviets, navigating the forest meant one thing: extreme caution. Captain Alexei Mirov led the armored detachment, sitting high in the cupola of his T-34-85 as flakes of frost clung to the steel surface. "This place feels cursed," muttered his driver, Grisha. Alexei didn't disagree. "The Germans chose this forest for a reason. Dense cover, narrow paths, perfect for ambushes. Stay sharp, no sudden moves." Radio chatter filled the cabin, distant Soviet units reporting movement, broken branches, and strange echoes deeper within the forest. The Soviets advanced slowly, using the terrain for cover, their tanks creeping forward with engines humming low. But they weren't alone. Deep inside the forest, concealed beneath camouflage nets and fallen branches, German Panther tanks waited in silence. Their commander, Oberleutnant Karl Weiss, had been preparing the defense for days. "The Soviets will struggle here," Karl whispered to his loader. "They rely on speed and numbers, but in this forest, speed becomes clumsy and numbers turn into confusion." Karl's Panther sat perfectly still, engine off, crew holding their breath. Snowflakes gathered on the hull, making the tank blend seamlessly with the winter landscape. A distant rumble approached. Karl smiled coldly. "They're here." The first Soviet tank emerged between the trees, its turret sweeping side to side, hornet-like in its movement. A moment later, another appeared, then another. "Wait," whispered Karl. The Panthers kept their guns trained on the Soviets, waiting for the perfect moment, when the column was committed, boxed in by terrain, unable to maneuver. Then it came. "Fire!" The Panther's 75mm gun roared with a thunderous crack. The shell tore through the silence, slamming directly into the side of the lead Soviet tank. The explosion lit the trees with a fiery flash. Before the falling debris hit the ground, two more Panthers opened fire from different angles. Inside Alexei's T-34, the world shook violently. "Ambush!" he shouted. "Hard right! Find cover!" Grisha jerked the controls, the tank swerving behind a knot of thick pines. Another shell smashed into the trunk, shredding bark like bullets tearing through canvas. "Commander!" the radio operator yelled. "We're losing units on the left and center." Alexei grabbed the radio. "All tanks, scatter! Do not stay in a straight line. Use the trees!" But scattering in a forest was easier said than done. The narrow paths split unpredictably, branches scraped the turrets, and the snow concealed fallen logs capable of disabling tracks. The Germans advanced. Panthers moved gracefully between the trees, engines purring softly. Their longer guns gave them accuracy, and their frontal armor made them nearly invincible from head-on. Karl Weiss felt the tension easing. "They're trapped in our web," he murmured. "One by one." He never finished the sentence. A T-34-85 burst from behind a fallen oak, firing at near point-blank range. The Soviet shell struck the Panther just below the gun mantlet. The armor buckled, flames bursting outward. Karl was thrown against the turret wall. Alarms blared. Smoke filled the cabin. "Get out!" he shouted. "Abandon the tank!" His crew scrambled as the Panther burned behind them. Alexei saw the explosion. "Good! Push forward! Don't let them regroup!" But the forest turned everything into chaos. Tanks crashed through undergrowth, turrets twisted wildly, and visibility dropped to mere meters as smoke and snow filled the air. A German Stug 3, hidden behind a large boulder, fired suddenly, hitting a Soviet tank in the track. The T-34 spun sideways, helpless. Its crew bailed out into the freezing snow. "Enemy assault gun on the ridge!" Alexei shouted. His gunner, Mikhail, rotated the turret and fired. The shells struck the Stug's thin armor, cracking it open like glass. The explosion echoed through the forest. For a moment, the battlefield fell quiet. Then a new sound emerged, even louder than the rest. A Tiger II. The massive Königstiger pushed through the trees like a metal fortress, tearing through branches as if they were nothing. Its armor glistened with frost, its cannon long and menacing. The Soviets froze at the sight of the behemoth. Alexei swallowed hard. This just got worse. The Tiger II fired. Its shell hit a distant T-34-85, piercing straight through it as if it were paper. The tank erupted in flames. "Retreat?" Grisha asked hesitantly. Alexei shook his head. "No. If we retreat, it will hunt us all down. We have to flank it. It's slow. That's our only advantage." He ordered his tanks to split into two groups. His own T-34 led the right flanking maneuver, accelerating through the thickets. The Tiger II turned slowly, tracking them. Its turret moved like a glacier, slow, deliberate, deadly. "Faster!" Alexei shouted. "Stay out of its firing arc!" The T-34 crashed through a fallen tree. Snow blasted into the air. "Gunner, aim for the side! Fire!" The Soviet shell hit the Königstiger's side armor and bounced off harmlessly. "No effect!" Mikhail yelled. "We need closer range!" The Tiger II fired again. The shot grazed the T-34, ripping chunks of metal from the hull. "Hold steady!" Alexei barked. The T-34 swerved behind a cluster of rocks. "Now, aim lower, where the armor is weakest!" The gun fired. This time the shell penetrated just above the track. The Tiger II shuddered, smoke bursting from the impact point. "Again!" The T-34 fired a second round. Sparks exploded across the Tiger's hull. The giant slowed, then finally stopped, motionless among the trees. A final explosion erupted inside its engine. The behemoth had fallen. With their heaviest armor destroyed and multiple Panthers knocked out, the German forces began withdrawing deeper into the forest. The Soviets regrouped, battered, but victorious. Alexei exhaled, finally allowing his shoulders to relax. We survived somehow. The forest was quiet again. But this time, the silence belonged to the Soviets.
The winter sun struggled to break through the thick clouds as the battlefield stretched endlessly across the horizon. A bleak wasteland of frozen earth, shattered bunkers, and the silent remains of dozens of tanks that had been destroyed in the days before. For both sides, ammunition was running low, fuel reserves were shrinking, and morale had been pushed to the breaking point. Yet today, on this bitter morning, both armies prepared for what they knew could be their final stand. On a small ridge overlooking the battlefield, Major Dmitry Karasev stood in the turret of his battle-scarred T-34-85. The tank's green paint was nearly gone, scorched by fires and scarred by shrapnel. But despite its wear, it still growled with purpose. Dmitry took a deep breath. "Men, today we hold the line. If the enemy breaks through here, they reach our supply route. And if they reach the supply route, the entire front collapses." His gunner Yuri nodded. "We won't let that happen, Commandeer." The radio crackled with reports. Recon patrols had spotted German armor massing on the far side of the valley. More than expected, more than intelligence had predicted. Dmitry listened closely. Panthers, tigers, possibly a Königstiger. They were throwing everything they had into this assault. He closed his eyes briefly, collecting his thoughts. "All tanks, form defensive positions. Do not waste ammunition. Wait for my command." Far across the frozen valley, the German force began to form up.
Oberstleutnant Otto Fechner, commander of the armored battle group, stood atop his Panther tank, scanning the Soviet defenses. "This is it," Otto said quietly. "If we break them here, we reopen the corridor. If we fail, Germany loses the northern line." His crew listened from inside the tank, the tension heavy but familiar. Otto climbed back down into the turret. "Ready the gun, engines at full idle. On my mark, we advance." For a moment, the valley stood frozen in silence. Then Otto raised his hand. "Forwards!" The German tanks surged forward. Panthers moved like swift predators, their engines roaring across the icy plain. Behind them, Tigers lumbered forward, their massive cannons pointed toward the Soviet ridge. Infantry followed in half-tracks, and anti-tank guns rolled behind armored carriers. The ground shook. Dmitri saw the movement almost immediately. "They're coming, and they're coming hard." His tank lurched as the engine throttled to life. "Hold your fire," Dmitri ordered. "Let them come into the kill zone." The Soviets had dug deep trenches, hidden their tanks behind ridges, and disguised anti-tank guns with branches and snow. Every shot had to count. The Germans continued advancing. The first shells were fired from long range, German artillery hammering the Soviet front line, explosions sending plumes of snow into the sky. "Brace!" Yuri shouted, as a shell exploded nearby, showering their tank with earth and ice. Dmitri held his breath. "Not yet! Not yet!" The Panthers grew closer. Their turrets scanned the ridge, searching for targets. "Now!" Dmitri roared. The valley erupted. Dozens of Soviet guns fired at once. T-34s, Su-85 tank destroyers, and trenches full of infantry armed with anti-tank rifles. The first volley caught the Germans by surprise. A Panther's ammunition rack exploded, sending flames high into the sky. Another was hit in the track, skidding violently before crashing into the frozen earth. But the Germans continued pushing. The Tigers returned fire. Their shells slammed into the ridge with devastating force. An Su-85 was hit directly, the explosion throwing metal fragments in every direction. Smoke rose quickly across the front line. "Load AP!" Yuri yelled. The T-34 fired again, the shot striking a half-track and flipping it onto its side. But as the smoke cleared, Dmitri saw something that made his heart sink. A Königsteiger, the massive Tiger II, pushing through the chaos, its thick armor gleaming with frost, its cannon sweeping the Soviet line like a giant steel scythe. The beast fired. A Soviet bunker vanished in a single explosion. Dmitri grabbed the radio. "All units, focus fire on the heavy tank. Do not let it breach the line." But hitting a Tiger II from the front was almost impossible. Shells bounced off its armor like pebbles off a cliff. The monster continued advancing, each step crushing debris beneath its treads. "We can't stop it from here," Yuri said, panic rising in his voice. Dmitri clenched his jaw. "Then we go down there." The crew stared at him. "You're serious?" Grisha asked. "Yes, our only chance is to hit it from the side. If we stay here, it will destroy everything." The T-34 roared forward, charging down the ridge at full speed. German shells whistled past them. One exploded close enough to rock the tank violently. "Keep going," Dmitri shouted. They weaved between craters, pushing through smoke and fire. As they approached the Tiger II, the giant turret turned slowly toward them. "Left, hard left," Dmitri yelled. The T-34 veered sharply, snow spraying from its tracks. The Tiger II fired. The shell missed by inches, the shockwave rattling every bolt in the Soviet tank. "Get to its flank," Dmitri ordered. They circled the Tiger II, its massive turret struggling to rotate quickly enough to keep up. "Now!" Dmitri shouted. "Aim low, just above the track." Yuri fired. The shell struck the Tiger II's side armor. Sparks exploded. Smoke leaked from the impact point, but the giant still moved. Again! A second shot. This time the shell penetrated. Flames burst from the engine compartment. The Tiger II stopped. The giant was dead. Cheers erupted across the Soviet radio. But there was no time to celebrate. More German tanks pushed forward. Overwhelming numbers. "We hold," Dmitri shouted. "No matter what happens, we hold this line." The battle intensified. Tanks exploded on both sides. Infantry charged through trenches. Smoke covered the sky like a storm cloud. After nearly an hour of brutal fighting, the German advance began to slow. Their tanks, once numerous, were now burning wrecks dotting the valley floor. Their infantry retreated. Their commanders fell back. The attack had been broken. Dmitri slumped back in his seat, exhausted. "We did it," Yuri whispered. Dmitri didn't respond right away. He stared across the battlefield, the smoke, the fire, and the silence that followed destruction. "Yes," he finally said, "but at a cost." The Soviets had held the line, and the German armored division would never recover from this defeat.
The sun had vanished behind a thick gray sky, casting the battlefield in a cold, unforgiving light. Snow fell steadily, blanketing the ground in white, but it could not hide the scars of war. Shattered tanks, smoldering wreckage, and the remnants of frozen trenches where men had fought and died. Today, the stakes were absolute. Whoever controlled the ridge overlooking the valley would command the final path to the enemy's rear, and possibly the outcome of the war in this sector. Captain Ivan Petrov sat in the turret of his T-34-85, frost clinging to his uniform. Around him, his crew moved with mechanical precision, preparing ammunition, checking radios, and scanning the horizon. Every muscle, every nerve was taut with anticipation. "Men," Ivan said, his voice steady despite the cold, "this is the moment we have trained for. The enemy expects hesitation. We give them none. Today we strike, and we strike with everything we have." The first German shells struck the valley floor moments later, their echo rolling off the hills like distant thunder. Smoke and ice exploded outward. The ground trembled beneath the T-34 as another tank was hit nearby. Flames licked the frozen ground. Ivan glanced through the periscope. In the distance, he could see them, a line of tigers and panthers moving into the valley. They were confident, well-ordered, and heavily armored. Their commanders were experienced. Their guns were deadly. Target acquisition. Find the lead tiger. The T-34 roared as Ivan pushed forward, weaving between cratered earth and shattered trees. His gunner, Sergei, adjusted the sights with a practiced hand, following the German movements. "They're advancing fast, too fast," Sergei said. "Then we make them pay for every meter," Ivan replied. The Soviet tanks fired as one, a coordinated barrage aimed to disrupt the German advance. The valley erupted with explosions. A panther was hit in the side, sending flames into the sky. Another tiger staggered, smoke pouring from its turret. But the Germans pressed on. Oberstleutnant Heinhard Schultz, commanding the German assault, barked orders from his panther. "Forward! Do not let them break the line. Every meter counts." His tank rolled forward, his crew bracing as Soviet shells detonated around them. The panthers and tigers moved with deadly precision, their armor shrugging off most of the incoming fire. German artillery added to the barrage, targeting Soviet bunkers and anti-tank positions. Ivan realized the ridge itself was the key. Whoever controlled it would dominate the battlefield. He steered his tank toward a narrow ravine that offered cover. Another Soviet tank followed, then another.
Soon a small group of T-34s formed a wedge, moving to flank the German line. "Prepare to fire on my mark," he said. The German commander spotted the movement. "Enemy flanking! Fired at them!" The German shells screamed through the air. One T-34 was hit directly, flipping violently and sliding across the snow. Its crew escaped just in time, but Ivan's tank remained on course. "Steady, steady," he muttered. Then, at last, the German Tiger came into range. Its massive cannon was aimed directly at Ivan's lead tank. The recoil of the gun was almost unimaginable, the sound deafening. Snow and ice exploded around the T-34. "Fire!" Ivan shouted. The shell struck the Tiger's side armor, the weaker point, penetrating and detonating its engine compartment. Flames erupted, smoke rising high into the winter sky. The massive tank lurched and stopped. "Keep pushing," Ivan yelled. "Don't give them time to regroup." The Soviet wedge pressed forward. T-34s and Su-85s advanced, firing on German positions with precision. Panthers were hit from unexpected angles, some disabled, others forced to retreat behind wreckage for cover. The battle became a brutal dance of steel. Each tank movement required calculation and courage. Every shot counted. Men inside the tanks gritted their teeth, following orders and instincts, aware that one mistake could be fatal. Despite heavy losses, the Germans began to falter. Their offensive slowed. Smoke and fire covered the valley, reducing visibility to mere meters, but Soviet tanks pressed relentlessly. "Hold the line," Ivan shouted over the roar. "This is our ridge. No one passes." The remaining Tigers and Panthers attempted one last assault, but by now the Soviet flank had encircled them. Shells struck repeatedly. One Tiger was disabled by an Su-85 shot to the track. Another Panther caught fire, abandoned by its crew. Finally, silence began to descend over the battlefield. Ivan's T-34 sat atop the ridge, track steaming in the cold air. Around him, the snow was scarred by tracks, craters, and wreckage. The cost had been high, but victory was theirs. The German armored division had been broken. Ivan exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air. "It's over, for now." Sergei glanced around. "We held the line, Commander." "Yes, but the war isn't over. We must remain ready. Today was only one battle." The ridge overlooked the valley, now silent, except for the occasional crackle of burning wrecks. Smoke drifted across the frozen landscape. The T-34s remained vigilant, engines idling, ready for whatever might come next. The final assault had succeeded. The Soviets controlled the ridge. The path forward was theirs. And though the cost had been heavy, courage, strategy, and unyielding determination had prevailed. The snow continued to fall, softening the harsh scars of battle, as the surviving tanks rolled onwards, carrying the men and their stories into the next